The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the carrier Akagi as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood silently, watching his pilots prepare for what he believed would be another routine victory. It was June 4th, 1942, and the Japanese combined fleet was approaching Midway Atoll with the confidence of conquerors who had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami. What Nagumo and his fellow senior officers failed to grasp was that they were sailing into the most consequential naval engagement in the Pacific War, one that would shatter the myth of Japanese invincibility forever. The genesis of this tragic miscalculation lay in the intoxicating string of victories that had followed Pearl Harbor. In just 6 months, Japanese forces had conquered the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, and countless Pacific islands. The Imperial Navy's carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, had operated with impunity, striking targets from Hawaii to Ceylon without suffering a single major loss. This unprecedented success had bred a dangerous arrogance among Japan's senior command, particularly Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Midway operation. Yamamoto's strategic vision for Midway was fundamentally flawed from its conception. He viewed the assault on the tiny coral atoll as a means to draw out and destroy the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet, particularly its carrier forces. What he and his subordinates failed to understand was that Midway represented far more than a tactical objective. It was America's forward bastion in the Central Pacific, a crucial stepping stone that protected Hawaii and the West Coast. The stakes were existential for both nations, yet only one side truly comprehended this reality. The Japanese planning process revealed the depth of their strategic myopia. Senior officers like Nagumo treated Midway as they had treated previous operations, a straightforward application of overwhelming force against an inferior enemy. They allocated resources and planned tactics based on the assumption that American resistance would collapse quickly, as it had elsewhere. This fundamental misunderstanding extended to their intelligence gathering, logistics, and even their understanding of American capabilities and resolve. According to wartime records from the U.S. Naval Institute, Japanese intelligence severely underestimated both American strength at Midway and the strategic importance the Americans placed on holding the atoll. The tragedy of Japanese miscalculation was compounded by their failure to appreciate the revolutionary changes taking place in naval warfare. While they remained fixated on the traditional concepts of decisive fleet action and battleship supremacy, the Americans had embraced the reality that aircraft carriers and aviation would determine the outcome of Pacific battles. This conceptual gap would prove fatal in the waters around Midway. As the Japanese fleet approached its target, the senior officers aboard the flagship carriers maintained their air of invincibility. They spoke confidently of another swift victory, another demonstration of Japanese superiority. Admiral Nagumo, despite his reservations about the operation's complexity, deferred to the optimism of his superiors and the weight of recent success. None of them realized they were sailing toward a carefully prepared trap, one that would expose the hollowness of their strategic assumptions and the devastating consequences of their overconfidence. The stage was set for a confrontation that neither side fully understood, but only one had prepared for adequately. While Japanese admirals basked in their overconfidence, a quiet revolution was unfolding in the basement of Pearl Harbor. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptographers had achieved what many considered impossible. They had broken the Japanese naval code, designated JN-25. This breakthrough would prove to be the decisive factor that Japanese senior officers never anticipated, fundamentally altering the balance of power in the Pacific. The intelligence coup began months before Midway, as Rochefort's team painstakingly decoded, intercepted Japanese transmissions. By early May 1942, they had identified a major Japanese operation targeting what the enemy called AF. The challenge was determining what AF represented. Through an ingenious deception, having Midway broadcast a false message about water shortages, the Americans confirmed that AF was indeed Midway Atoll. This revelation gave Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, an unprecedented advantage. He knew when and where the Japanese would strike. Japanese senior officers, meanwhile, operated under the assumption that their communications remained secure. Admiral Yamamoto's complex battle plan relied heavily on surprise and the element of shock. He divided his forces into multiple groups approaching from different directions, believing this would confuse and overwhelm American defenders. What he could not have imagined was that every movement, every tactical decision, was being monitored and analyzed by enemy intelligence. The strategic implications of this intelligence advantage were profound, yet Japanese leadership remained blind to the possibility that their codes had been compromised. Their planning meetings, conducted with the assumption of absolute secrecy, were in reality being observed by their enemies. Every discussion about timing, force composition, and tactical objectives was transmitted back to Pearl Harbor, where American commanders used this information to position their forces for maximum effect. Admiral Nimitz, armed with Rochefort's intelligence, made decisions that seemed impossibly prescient to Japanese observers. He positioned his 3 available aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway, exactly where they could deliver maximum damage to the approaching Japanese fleet. The Americans also reinforced Midway itself with every available aircraft, creating a layered defense that Japanese planners had not anticipated. The National Security Agency's declassified documents from 1977 reveal the extent to which American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese naval communications, providing tactical intelligence that proved decisive at Midway. The Japanese approach to intelligence gathering reflected their broader strategic blindness. They relied heavily on assumptions about American capabilities and intentions, rather than concrete intelligence. Their submarine reconnaissance was inadequate, and they failed to detect the presence of American carrier forces in the area. This intelligence failure was not merely tactical, it reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of their enemy's capabilities and determination. Senior Japanese officers compounded their intelligence failures through rigid adherence to predetermined plans. Even when evidence suggested that Americans were better prepared than expected, they pressed forward with their original strategy. The concept of adapting to new intelligence was foreign to their military culture, which prized decisive action over flexible response. As the Japanese fleet approached Midway on the morning of June 4th, they did so with the confidence of hunters stalking prey. They could not have imagined that they were actually the hunted, that every movement was being tracked and anticipated by an enemy who had turned their greatest strength, surprise, into their most devastating weakness. The intelligence war had already been won and lost before the first shots were fired, though only one side knew it. Dawn on June 4th, 1942, brought with it a series of tactical decisions that would expose the fundamental flaws in Japanese strategic thinking. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force from the bridge of Akagi, faced his first critical choice of the day. Should he launch a second strike against Midway's installations, or should he prepare his aircraft to engage the American fleet that his reconnaissance planes had just reported? His decision to rearm his bombers with land attack weapons instead of maintaining them in an anti-ship configuration would prove to be one of the most consequential errors in naval history. The Japanese senior officers' misunderstanding of Midway's stakes became apparent in their tactical priorities. They treated the engagement as a routine operation against a fixed target, similar to their previous successes across the Pacific. Nagumo's decision to prioritize the suppression of Midway's airfield over fleet action revealed a fundamental misreading of American intentions and capabilities. He assumed that American naval forces, if present, would behave predictably and defensively, giving him time to systematically reduce Midway's defenses before dealing with any seaborne threat. This tactical myopia was compounded by the Japanese failure to maintain adequate combat air patrol over their own fleet. Despite launching over 100 aircraft against Midway in the first wave, Nagumo kept only a token force of fighters airborne to protect his carriers. This decision reflected the senior officers' belief that American air power posed minimal threat to their experienced and well-trained forces. They had become so accustomed to operating without serious opposition that they had forgotten the basic principles of defensive warfare. The morning's first engagement, American torpedo bombers attacking the Japanese fleet, should have served as a warning to Japanese commanders about the intensity of American resistance. Instead, senior officers interpreted the failed attacks as confirmation of American inferiority. They watched with satisfaction as their Zero fighters and anti-aircraft guns destroyed wave after wave of obsolete American torpedo bombers, never recognizing that these gallant but doomed attacks were serving a crucial strategic purpose. They were drawing Japanese fighters down to sea level and disrupting the careful timing of Japanese operations. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet epitomized American determination that Japanese officers had consistently underestimated. Leading 15 outdated Devastator torpedo bombers without fighter escort, Waldron pressed his attack against overwhelming odds. Every aircraft in his squadron was shot down, with only one crew member surviving. Yet this sacrifice, along with similar attacks by torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown, created the tactical conditions that would doom the Japanese fleet. According to the official U.S. Navy historical account published in 1947, these torpedo attacks, while unsuccessful individually, were crucial in setting up the decisive dive bomber assault that followed. The Japanese response to these attacks revealed their continued misunderstanding of the battle's significance. Rather than recognizing the coordination and determination behind these seemingly suicidal attacks, senior officers dismissed them as evidence of American desperation and poor tactical planning. They failed to appreciate that American commanders were willing to accept tremendous casualties to achieve their strategic objectives, a level of commitment that the Japanese had not encountered in their previous Pacific conquests. Admiral Nagumo's handling of the rearming operation exposed another critical flaw in Japanese thinking. The process of switching ordnance from land attack bombs to armor-piercing shells was complex and time-consuming, leaving aircraft crowded on flight decks with fuel lines and ammunition scattered about. This vulnerability would have been unacceptable to commanders who truly understood the stakes of the engagement, but Japanese senior officers remained confident in their ability to complete the rearming before any serious threat materialized. As the morning progressed, Japanese tactical decisions continued to reflect their fundamental misreading of the situation. They had entered the battle expecting another easy victory and found themselves increasingly off balance as American resistance proved far more determined and coordinated than anticipated. At 10:24 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the war in the Pacific reached its turning point. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 37 dive bombers from the carrier Enterprise, emerged from the clouds above the Japanese fleet at precisely the moment when enemy carriers were most vulnerable. Below him, the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance, a testament to the Japanese senior officers' fatal miscalculation of American capabilities and resolve. The scene that McCluskey witnessed, from 14,000 feet above, perfectly encapsulated the strategic blindness that had brought the Japanese fleet to this moment of catastrophe. Admiral Nagumo's carriers were caught in the worst possible tactical situation. Their aircraft were being rearmed and refueled. Their combat air patrol had been drawn down to sea level by the earlier torpedo attacks, and their defensive formations were optimized for surface action rather than air defense. It was a situation that competent naval commanders should never have allowed to develop. Yet Japanese senior officers had been so confident in their superiority that they had ignored fundamental principles of carrier warfare. The first bomb struck Kaga at 10:26 a.m., penetrating the flight deck and detonating among the aircraft and ordnance below. The explosion triggered a chain reaction that would consume the entire ship within hours. Almost simultaneously, bombs began falling on Akagi and Soryu, each hit multiplying the destruction as fuel and ammunition added their own violent contributions to the inferno. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were burning wrecks, their experienced air crews trapped below decks or consumed in the flames. Admiral Nagumo, aboard the doomed Akagi, finally grasped the magnitude of his miscalculation as he watched his flagship transform into a floating funeral pyre. The confident assumptions that had guided Japanese planning, that American forces were inferior, that American resolve was weak, that Japanese tactical superiority was absolute, were literally going up in smoke around him. The admiral who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor now found himself trapped on a burning carrier, his strike force shattered by an enemy he had consistently underestimated. The tactical brilliance of the American attack lay not just in its timing, but in its coordination. While McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise were devastating Kaga and Akagi, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's squadron from Yorktown was simultaneously attacking Soryu. This level of coordination was precisely what Japanese senior officers had deemed impossible for American forces to achieve. Their intelligence estimates had consistently portrayed American naval aviation as disorganized and technically inferior, assessments that were now being dramatically disproven. The official Japanese Navy War Diary, captured after the war and translated by Allied intelligence, reveals the shock and disbelief among senior officers as they realized the extent of their tactical defeat. The destruction of 3 carriers in a matter of minutes represented more than a tactical disaster. It was the collapse of an entire strategic worldview. The Japanese concept of Kantai Kessen, the decisive fleet action that would establish naval supremacy in the Pacific, had been turned against them. Instead of destroying American naval power, Japanese senior officers had delivered their own most valuable assets into the hands of an enemy who proved far more capable and determined than they had imagined. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu exemplified the tragic nobility of Japanese officers who finally understood the stakes too late. Choosing to go down with his ship rather than abandon his men, Yanagimoto represented the best of Japanese naval tradition, while simultaneously embodying the failure of Japanese strategic thinking. His personal courage could not compensate for the institutional blindness that had brought his ship to this moment of destruction. The surviving Japanese officers, many of them pulled from burning flight decks by destroyers and cruisers, began to comprehend the true magnitude of their defeat. They had not merely lost a battle, they had lost the strategic initiative that had carried them across the Pacific for 6 months. The myth of Japanese invincibility was sinking beneath the waves, along with their carriers. The afternoon of June 4th, 1942, brought a desperate Japanese counterattack that would only serve to emphasize the depth of their strategic miscalculation. Admiral Yamaguchi, commanding the sole surviving carrier Hiryu, launched every operational aircraft he possessed in a bid to salvage something from the disaster. His target was the American carrier Yorktown, and his attack would succeed in damaging her severely. Yet even this tactical success could not mask the fundamental reality that Japanese senior officers had gambled their nation's future on a flawed understanding of their enemy and lost catastrophically. The Hiryu's attack on Yorktown represented both the best and worst of Japanese naval aviation. The pilots who pressed home their assault displayed the skill and courage that had made Japanese carrier aviation feared throughout the Pacific. They managed to score several hits on Yorktown, forcing her crew to abandon ship temporarily. However, the strategic context of their success revealed the hollow nature of their achievement. They were attacking with the remnants of what had been the most powerful carrier force in the world, reduced to a single operational flight deck by their commander's hubris. Admiral Yamaguchi's decision to continue fighting, rather than withdraw with his remaining forces, reflected the same strategic blindness that had doomed his compatriots earlier in the day. Japanese military culture emphasized death before dishonor, but this philosophy, when applied to strategic decision-making, often prevented commanders from making rational assessments of cost and benefit. Yamaguchi's gallant but futile gesture would cost Japan its last remaining carrier in the operation when American dive bombers found and destroyed Hiryu later that afternoon. The broader implications of the day's disasters were not lost on the more perceptive Japanese officers. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and was now hospitalized aboard a cruiser with appendicitis, later wrote of watching the smoke columns rising from the burning carriers and realizing that Japan had lost the war. His assessment, while premature, captured the essential truth that Midway represented: the end of Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific and the beginning of an inexorable American advance toward the Japanese home islands. The human cost of Japanese strategic miscalculation was staggering. Beyond the loss of 4 fleet carriers and their escorting vessels, Japan lost over 3,000 trained personnel, including many of her most experienced pilots and aircrew. These were irreplaceable assets, men who had trained for years and possessed combat experience that could not be quickly replicated. The American victory at Midway was built not just on superior intelligence and tactics, but on a willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives that Japanese commanders had failed to understand. Historian Gordon Prange's comprehensive study Miracle at Midway, published in 1982, documented how Japanese losses in trained personnel would prove even more decisive than the loss of ships in determining the Pacific War's outcome. Admiral Yamamoto, learning of the disaster from his position with the main battle fleet several hundred miles away, faced the bitter realization that his strategic masterpiece had become a catastrophic failure. The complex plan that was supposed to lure American forces into a decisive engagement had instead delivered Japan's most valuable military assets into an expertly laid trap. His decision to divide his forces among multiple task groups, a tactic designed to confuse and overwhelm American defenders, had instead allowed the Americans to concentrate their limited resources against his most valuable units. The evening brought the final confirmation of Japanese defeat as Hiryu joined her sister ships beneath the Pacific waves. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship, taking with him not just personal honor, but also the accumulated experience and tactical knowledge that Japan could not afford to lose. His death, while maintaining the traditions of Japanese naval service, represented the kind of strategic waste that characterized the entire Midway operation. As darkness fell on June 4th, Japanese senior officers began the painful process of acknowledging that their fundamental assumptions about the Pacific War had been wrong. They had entered the battle expecting to complete their conquest of the Pacific. Instead, they found themselves beginning a long retreat that would end only with Japan's surrender 3 years later. The weeks following the Battle of Midway revealed the full extent of how catastrophically Japanese senior officers had misunderstood the stakes of their Pacific gamble. As damage reports filtered back to Tokyo and the true scope of the defeat became apparent, the Japanese high command faced an uncomfortable truth. They had not merely lost a battle, but had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of power in the Pacific. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, lay as shattered as the hulks of their carriers on the ocean floor. Admiral Yamamoto's return to Japan marked the beginning of a painful reassessment of Japanese strategic doctrine. The architect of Pearl Harbor, who had warned his superiors that Japan could only hope for victory in a short war, now found his worst fears confirmed. The Midway operation, designed to deliver a knockout blow to American naval power, had instead awakened a sleeping giant that possessed both the industrial capacity and strategic vision to wage total war across the Pacific. Japanese senior officers who had dismissed American resolve and capability were forced to confront the reality of an enemy that had outthought, outfought, and outplanned them at every crucial juncture. The strategic consequences of Midway extended far beyond the immediate loss of ships and personnel. Japan's offensive capability in the Central Pacific was permanently crippled, forcing a shift from conquest to defense that would define the remainder of the war. The senior officers who had planned aggressive operations to seize Midway, Fiji, Samoa, and eventually Hawaii were now compelled to contemplate how to defend positions they had already conquered. This fundamental shift in strategic posture represented the death of Japanese hopes for a negotiated peace from a position of strength. Perhaps most significantly, the Battle of Midway demonstrated to both sides that the Pacific War would be determined by industrial capacity rather than tactical brilliance or martial spirit. American shipyards were already launching new carriers and training new aircrew to replace their losses, while Japan struggled to rebuild forces that had taken years to develop. The senior officers who had gambled Japan's irreplaceable naval, aviation assets at Midway had condemned their nation to fight a prolonged war of attrition against an enemy with vastly superior resources. The intelligence lessons of Midway were particularly bitter for Japanese senior officers to acknowledge. The revelation that American codebreakers had penetrated their most secure communications forced a complete overhaul of Japanese cryptographic systems, but the damage was already done. The psychological impact of learning that their enemy had been reading their most secret plans was almost as devastating as the physical losses suffered in battle. Senior officers who had prided themselves on strategic sophistication were forced to admit that they had been outmaneuvered by an enemy intelligence service they had consistently underestimated. The post-war strategic bombing survey conducted by the United States documented how Midway marked the beginning of Japan's recognition that the war could not be won through conventional military means. The personal toll on Japanese senior officers was equally severe. Many of the commanders who survived Midway never fully recovered from the psychological impact of the defeat. Admiral Nagumo, who had led the successful Pearl Harbor attack, found his reputation permanently tarnished by his tactical decisions at Midway. The weight of having presided over Japan's greatest naval disaster would shadow him for the remainder of his career and ultimately contribute to his death by suicide in Saipan 2 years later. The broader lesson of Midway, that strategic vision and industrial capability ultimately triumph over tactical excellence and fighting spirit, would be confirmed repeatedly in the battles that followed. Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, and dozens of smaller engagements would demonstrate that Japanese senior officers had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the war they had initiated. Their failure to grasp Midway's true stakes had cost them not just a battle, but the war itself. As the Pacific War ground on through 3 more years of increasingly desperate fighting, the ghost of Midway haunted every Japanese strategic decision. The senior officers who had sailed so confidently toward that tiny coral atoll in June 1942 had learned too late that understanding your enemy is more important than defeating him, and that strategic miscalculation in modern warfare carries consequences that no amount of courage or tactical skill can overcome. The waves that closed over the burning Japanese carriers at Midway also closed over Japan's hopes for victory in the Pacific War.